think everyone who does gay and lesbian studies is haunted by the suicides of adolescents. To us, the hard statistics come easily, that queer teenagers are 2 to 3 times likelier to attempt suicide and to accomplish it than others. That up to 30% of teen suicides are likely to be gay or lesbian. That a third of lesbian and gay teenagers say they have attempted suicide. That minority queer adolescents are at even more extreme risk. The knowledge is indelible but not astonishing to anyone with a reason to be attuned to the profligate way this culture has of denying and despoiling queer energies and lives. I look at my adult friends and colleagues doing lesbian and gay work, and I feel that the survival of each one is a miracle. Those sentences come from the beginning of an essay that opens Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick's 1993 book, Tendencies. It's an essay entitled Queer and Now, which of course is a pun on the phrase here and now. We'll come back to that idea of the title of that essay later in this lecture series. Kate Haffey, in the article on Mrs. Dalloway we read and discussed 2 weeks ago, an example of queer literary criticism, actually quotes this passage on, I have it written on pages 143 to 44. And she does so in order to theorize alongside Sedgwick a sense of how a moment operates in Mrs. Dalloway. A moment as opposed to just a kind of duration of passing time, right? What is the temporality of a moment? And she does it in order to challenge readings of Clarissa Dalloway's the most exquisite moment of Clarissa Dalloway's life. Namely, the kiss between Sally Seton and Clarissa when they were both young women. But on its own, divorced from the context of this argument, Sedgwick's passage trembles with a sense of anguish, even anger, vulnerability, and urgency that we have not observed in the other texts of theory and criticism that we've read or that I've introduced to you. We certainly didn't see it in Seymour Chapman's attempt to give an account of narrative grammar. We didn't see it in Cleanth Brooks's attempt to fix the project of what literary criticism should be. Though they certainly were both highly motivated, highly interested. Anguish and anger and urgency did not seem to be the affects at work in those texts. We didn't even really see it in Toril Moy's attempt to defend Woolf from Elaine Showalter's critique in a literature of their own. Although, of course, it would be stupid to say that anguish, vulnerability, anger, and urgency aren't part of feminist literary criticism or feminist politics. They certainly are. I'm merely marking that this is the first time that something, I hesitate to call it deeply personal, but for the sake of swiftness, that's what I'll call it. Something deeply personal enters into one of the works of theory and criticism that we're reading. In fact, by isolating this passage from Sedgwick, it gives us a dimension of the queer, and I'll be talking about this in this video, that really goes unacknowledged in Parker's text, in our textbook, although he spends some time on it, but also unacknowledged in Haffey's article. Though Haffey's handling of queer theory and criticism about Mrs. Dalloway and the organization of her argument about Mrs. Dalloway and the hours is brilliant, and in fact many of you expressed that Haffey's article was your favorite, and for any of you who may someday in the future think about going on to grad school, the organization of this essay is a perfect model for how to think about long seminar papers and even book chapters and certainly journal articles. While it is quite brilliant, her interest in the queer and in aligning the temporality of Clarissa's kiss with Sally Seton, with queerness, right, expresses none or really very little of the same urgency, the same energy, we might say, as Sedgwick. We don't really sense the haunting in Haffey's article, although the haunting is certainly part of her argument about how the moment works in Mrs. Dalloway. It's worth asking ourselves, what is queer in Haffey's argument? Not just what is queerness, but what is it? What is queer, right? What does she identify as queer in Mrs. Dalloway, right? It's not so much the sexuality of Clarissa or Sally, right? Not so much that. But rather it's time itself. Time itself is queer in Haffey's argument. In fact, it is the temporality of the moment itself, the exquisite moment, how moments themselves operate as memories in Mrs. Dalloway, that is queer. Okay. So if we look at page 138 of Haffey's article, she writes, "Perhaps this kiss, meaning between Clarissa and Sally, has drawn the attention of queer theorists interested in temporality, because it seems to upset or rupture the forward flow of time in narrative. It marks as significant, excuse me, I skipped a part. It is a moment that recurs for Clarissa throughout the text, a moment that the text marks as significant, but one that seems to be outside the cause and effect logic of narrative. Such issues are beginning to become of interest within the emerging discourse of queer temporality." This article was published in 2010. Since then, there has been more work done theorizing and thinking about what on earth a phrase like that could mean. Though queer temporality has yet to turn directly to consider the question of narrative temporality, that is, how time works in narratives, in the stories we tell and the way in which we organize them, and the expectations we have about how they should move forward. Theorists like Stockton, Yagos, and Halberstam consider the way in which cultural narratives are based on a sense of time that directly correlates to heterosexuality. For example, within narrative, time often moves according to the progression through a set of normal life stages, from childhood through adolescence to marriage and reproduction. In such a framework, a single kiss can hold little significance. And yet Mrs. Dalloway repeatedly insists on the significance of this moment. For this reason, I think it is important to investigate the moment of the kiss specifically as a moment, and that she's just really hammering on the repetition of that word, a moment that is counter to the normal flow of time in narrative. In response, then, to several scholars who, as Haffey puts it, normalize the effects of Clarissa's experience, including Elizabeth Bell, who we read several weeks ago, Haffey argues that moments operate queerly, right? Not just oddly, but counter-normatively, right? In resistance to expectations and anticipations of how things are and how things should be and how things should develop. Looking at page 145, halfway down 145, quote, "Thus moments seem to do a few things in Mrs. Dalloway. Rather than merely recalling the past, as so many arguments state, they make visible the very presence of that past. Moments also function to dissolve the difference between Clarissa's childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Finally, they are the place in which narratives of development, right, cause and effect, slow, progressive maturity toward the sort of adult all characters should eventually become, in which narratives like this break down, because they do not show progression, but rather depict the simultaneous presence of multiple identities. Note what she claims moments do. Make visible the very presence of the past, right? Upsetting the distinction between present and past. Moments dissolve the difference, or we might say the opposition or the distinctness between childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. They don't equate them, but they begin to overlap in ways that it becomes quite murky and difficult to distinguish between them. And it also breaks down clear, linear narratives of development, right? Unpacking, breaking down, dissolving, right? These are the kinds of verbs that Haffey is associating with how queerness operates. Turning to the next page, I have 146 written down here. What did I want to read? What did I want to read? So halfway down, a little over halfway down the page, though a number of critics have read Septimus' suicide, we'll return to Septimus in the last lecture of this series, as the vehicle through which Clarissa is able to finally put her past behind her. This is Abel's reading, Elizabeth Abel's reading, right? I would suggest that the incident does not represent Clarissa closing the door to her past, but rather shows how the preservation of her feelings for Sally is essential to her life. Without the space to keep her memory of Sally alive, Clarissa too might have plunged to her death. Many critics argue that Septimus' suicide causes an epiphany for Clarissa, one that allows her to leave the internal world of her memory and return to the physical world of the party. If this scene is an epiphany, it is one of quite a different sort. It is a moment that allows Clarissa to see the presence of her past, to experience the pleasure of having her past return to her. Okay. So Haffey will go on to argue, again in opposition to many Woolf critics, that it is precisely Clarissa and time itself is queer precisely in the sense that Clarissa has organized and arranged her life as such, right? Marrying Richard being one of the ways in which she's organized her life, in order to keep those sorts of moments, those exquisite moments, those queer moments alive and present in her life, right? And in some sense, that's Haffey's argument. That's precisely the point of Clarissa's experience at the end, her affirmation and transvaluation of Septimus' death, and also in some sense, why Clarissa is in some sense so isolated from the rest of the people in the novel as well, and why she's the double of Septimus. Okay. Skipping to the very end of the article, page 159. This will be, I think, the last part I'll read from Haffey's article. Forgive me, I've got a little bit of a cough developing. I'm trying to get rid of. Anyway, she writes at the very end of her article on page 159, quote, "It is perhaps for this reason that the kiss became the central trope for the moment for both authors," meaning Cunningham and Woolf. In both texts, the kiss is explored as a kiss, rather than as a stop along the way to sex, to a climax, or to a narrative development that ends in marriage and kids, right? The kiss itself partakes of an interesting and strange temporality. The moment of the kiss is the moment in which a relationship takes a sexual turn. It is a moment of something that is yet unknown. Within the framework of presumptive heterosexuality, this future is often pre-imagined, right? As a script, courtship, marriage, reproduction, etc. In other words, the kiss is within the sort of imaginary of heterosexuality. Haffey is arguing. Kissing is part of a script, right, that either leads to sex or leads to this story of a relationship that ends in happily ever after, right? But in these texts, rather than getting a happily ever after, the kiss is a moment in which we linger. celebrating not the possibility of a scripted future, their script, but the soaring hope of the moment itself, the moment in which our lives seem, quote, to burst open and give us everything we've ever imagined, end quote. Perhaps it is only within the forward motion of reproductive time that the moment loses its significance and its power. We'll be coming back to this notion of reproductive time maybe in the next video. For within, she continues and concludes, within queer temporality, the moment is not merely enough. She questions whether that is really a satisfying way to end Mrs. Dalloway. That just an affirmation of moments? Really? Don't we need more than that? We don't need more than that. It's not merely enough, she argues. It is the opening to a future that is not yet decided. End quote. So in investigating the queerness of temporality, what energies or elements of Mrs. Dalloway, the novel, and Clarissa Dalloway, the character, is Haffey trying to disclose? Or if we generalize that question, what do queer theorists or critics, whether haunted by the suicide of gay adolescents or not, what are they attempting to give an account of in the materials, texts, and or media that they study? Taking our cues from Haffey, we could argue that what is associated with queerness, what these authors are attempting to disclose about the things that they're studying, are elements that are counter-normative. We'll talk about what that means later. Discontinuous, meaning things that bring about a rupture of our expectations and anticipations of how things should go. Things that resist guilt or shame. Or moments that completely reconceptualize and transvalue, meaning in some sense redefine and affirm guilt and shame. Energies that are experimental or practices that are experimental. They focus on energies that are sensual, sensuous, or sexual. And it also focuses on freedom, right? And not just the sorts of freedom of liberal humanism, right? Which is a freedom that is claimed to be sort of innate in all of us, right? And that states should just sort of recognize. But rather, the freedom that certain kinds of spaces give to us, right? Spaces that often queer lives have to create for themselves in order to operate freely. Right, and to do the sorts of experiments and reconceptualizations and affirmations that Haffey and other queer theorists and critics are attempting to bring to light, right, and analyze. Okay, so and I'll stop there for this video because it went a little long. In the next video, I hope I'm going to return to Sedgwick, to that passage I read at the beginning of this video. And try to give an account of the queer or of queerness that I don't want to call it the more negative side of things. Because that's not quite what I mean. But the side that Haffey and certainly Parker sort of leave out of their account, and by that I mean the sort of haunting sense of a history and of ruined, damaged, or lost lives that it might not be a good idea to forget, right, in the more affirmative work that queer studies pursues. Okay, I'll be back.